Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. My guest today is Bryan Smith. He has decades of experience teaching and leading schools in the great tradition. He is one of the foremost leaders in the classical education world. After our discussion today, you will understand why he is such an important voice in the world of classical education. And I'm also proud to announce one of our sponsors. Not only are they sponsoring this interview with Bryan Smith, but they're also sponsoring our first online classical education conference. If you want more information about my classical education conference, please visit my website, beautifulteaching.com. Our sponsor, Beautiful Feet Books, follows the Charlotte Mason philosophy of learning through great literature. They specialize in providing the best books for teaching history, geography, and science through the power of literature. They have a great selection of living books. I used Beautiful Feet Books for our homeschool, and we loved it. Their website is bfbooks.com. And during our conference, Beautiful Feet will be giving away several $50 gift cards. So check out our conference speakers, our breakouts, and the entire schedule at my website, beautifulteaching.com. And don't forget to support Beautiful Feet Books. You can link to them from my website on the conference page, which is beautifulteaching.com/conference. Now enjoy this interview with Bryan Smith. Bryan Smith, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I'm thrilled to have you. What I'd like to do is start off by having you introduce yourself to our guests, our listeners, and tell our listeners how you got into education.
Yeah, well, my name is Bryan Smith. I'm primarily from Texas. My family has deep roots there, and I I've thought about this question before. How did I get into classical education? Because I've been asked that a lot, having been teaching for over 30 years, and most of that's been in liberal arts and classical schools. Um, I, I didn't have a road to Damascus experience about classical education. What I did have is some seeds sown in my own upbringing by my parents, in that my mother used to take me and my older sister to museums quite frequently. It was her way of just getting us out of the house. We would go to art museums, and she really just let us wander around and look at things. And so we had a habit of just contemplating and enjoying artwork. And then also, my mother used to read a lot of poetry to us. So that was that was just something we grew up with. And my father, being a minister, had a rather extensive library, and I once found Plutarch's Lives in among some of his books. And I I remember reading a few of those just because I had found the book, and uh, and recalled him telling a story that I was reading in the course of a sermon. You know? So I had that in my own uh, upbringing, I guess.
That's
And
so lovely. That actually reminds me of C.S. Lewis and how he sort of stumbled into George MacDonald, right?
right, yeah.
That's
Well,
fun.
yeah, and so I guess I would say, I'll say another big influence on me was when you grow up, there's an entire civic iconography in Texas, almost a civic religion in Texas about Texas. And then when you grow up going to the Alamo and seeing the statues of those heroes up there out on the street, and you go inside and you see the giant paintings, and you put your fingers in what you think are bullet holes, and you look up and say, my lords and my gods. It really is a civic religion. And so you get this sense of the heroic and all of that as a kid growing up. So I had all that in my background. However, I was myself, I went through my own schooling, all in public school. Uh, and I guess it was really when I had children and started becoming aware that schools were changing, they were different from the way they were when I was a kid. Um, I started reading about schooling and getting an idea of the different philosophies that were around. So, and of course, what I gravitated to was um, the great books,
Hmm.
the permanent things, that sort of thing. And that's something that, again, once upon a time in that part of the country, you take in that idea of the permanent things, and the goodness of tradition and so on. So I uh, so that was and then my own association with the University of Dallas, of course,
Hmm.
really gave me a much better idea of what the great tradition was, and what tradition is. And I was able to get my children in a school that was related to the University of Dallas, and it was a liberal arts school. And that's what I guess got me into the liberal arts tradition of education.
Hmm. You are modeling the you're modeling humility because you haven't told our listeners all of the experience that you have, which is quite extensive. So I'd love for you to share that too as well.
Well, sometimes a lot of uh, someone asked an old fellow, I forget the quote, what he attributed his long life to, and he said, to the fact that I haven't died yet. And sometimes that's what we can attribute our great experience to. But yeah, I, I first got into teaching. Um, I guess it was first as teaching history and government. Um, I I was teaching. After that, I taught in a small liberal arts school related to the University of Dallas, associated with it loosely. And I taught art, history, uh, government, and they gave me biology for some reason. But I was always so happy they did, because it grounded me in the physical reality of humans, which you need to be aware of, as well as the psychological and spiritual. So, but in time, I always had an interest in the overall project, not just my own subject area. And that's one of the problems in modern education, is the disintegration of the disciplines. But I
Hmm.
loved thinking across the disciplines, so I got into curriculum work, and that was my first entrance into administration, was curriculum work. And then I discovered, well, I became a head of a middle school, then an assistant head, and then was a founding headmaster for 3 schools: one private school in Fort Worth, private classical school, and 2 charter schools with Great Hearts Academies.
Hmm. Hmm. So tell us a little bit about what attracted you to the classical education model. I mean, you've shared your story, but I also know there are things about the classical education model that are attractive, and I'd like to hear a little bit about what that would be for you.
Yeah, as I've mentioned to you, what's attractive to me, and I mentioned this to you, is I don't really think in terms of a model, but as an ethos or a character. And I think that um, I think of classical education as liberal education, that is, an education in certain arts that free us from what's low, mediocre, base,
Mhm.
time bound. It frees us from these things and shows us what's um, a broader reflection, a more universal reflection, higher noble aims. Um, and so a liberal education, which imparts things that are not merely from our own personal habits or inclinations, but rather um, things that we find universally in the human experience. So children are not allowed to be like Narcissus, staring at their own image all the time,
Mhm.
but we have to look up from that pool and see other things and other experiences, and we learn. It's interesting because the education that comes out of the very thoughtful work of John Dewey, although much of it I would find problematic, is described as an education in experience,
Mhm.
experiential education. But the liberal arts tradition is very much an education in experience. It's simply not only our experience, it's an education in the experience of an entire culture and
Mhm.
civilization. We pay attention to the experiences of others, not just our own. So um, that's what I like. I think what's compelling about this character that I said, this ethos of the classical tradition, is that it presents a hopeful view of humanity.
Mhm.
It presents a realistic expectation of evil and the more uncomfortable aspects of human life and experience. It does present a realistic expectation of that. It also helps to form uh, a person in what to love. It
Mhm.
doesn't just guide us to be cynical and sneering about everything, but it does show us good things to love and to imitate.
Mhm.
And so it's uplifting, it's compelling, it has a noble end. It lets us know that we have a noble end,
Mhm.
and it actually excuses us of our imperfections. Doesn't require us to be perfect, like sort of the secular puritanism of modern education. So
Mhm.
those are things that I find compelling about it. It lets us know that we have a good end.
Expand a little bit about what you mean by secular Puritanism. I'd
Well,
like to hear more about that.
well, I don't have a real doctrine on this, but it's a term I use for a secular world that claims to want to free itself from what it would caricature as strictures of religion, you know, uh,
Hmm.
but in fact imposes uh, a mindset, imposes dogmas, imposes ways of believing and acting as rigidly as, well,
Right. As what they're accusing. Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
They're doing the very thing that
Right.
they are
Yeah, yeah.
trying to destroy.
That's
Yeah.
that's right. And if you don't fall in line, you'll be branded with a scarlet R or a scarlet uh,
Yeah.
N.
Yeah.
You're a Nazi or you're something.
Yeah. That's really good. So, what are some principles from the classical tradition that stand out to you as being necessary in order to call your school classical?
Uh, um, I think that I'll go, I guess, from deeper things to more superficial things, and
Mhm.
I I would say that in the first place, a classical school, anything can be done well or anything can be done poorly. And
Mhm.
anybody out there who has taught in a faculty or who has hired teachers, you've all seen that person who said, "Now we need you to teach uh, the Divine Comedy." Oh yeah, yeah. Any text can be taught horribly and inaccurately. you know, there can be a Marxist spin on anything. Um, so one thing is that I think you need to have a community of the faculty, and an understanding of the whole project that embodies these things. Number one is that our ultimate focus is on what's permanent. We're teaching students. I like the Narcissus analogy because this is what this is what our students are like. They're gazing at their own images, and we need to pull them away from their own superficial images, and we're going to teach them more about themselves by broadening them out, showing them their larger human family across ages, across continents, across languages. And they're going to learn more about themselves then than they would by continuing to adore themselves in the reflection. So, first of all, we want to teach them about, why in the world would somebody listen to uh, a Greek poet from 800 years BC? Only because there may be something permanent and universal in all of us that have bearing on each other. So we listen to these people of different times and different cultures so that we can learn things about ourselves. So the permanent things, so that needs to be sort of an anchor for a classical school. However, those permanent things are embodied in assumptions, texts, works of art, and that could be, works of art like paintings and artwork. It could be dramatic productions and so on, but also maxims. These things get distilled into little maxims like do a few things well, like moderation in all things. There's a whole series of maxims that are tradition that are part of the tradition. And then stories. Many of the stories you will find in texts, but the stories and the motifs of stories uh, will get rewritten, retold, um, and um, and so that's what sort of makes up the heart, I guess, of what I would call a classical school, is they're trying to transmit what's permanent, that they do hold certain basic assumptions about human nature and the nature of the world. Those are assumptions like things have natures, the goodness of being, the goodness of form, that virtue is a mean, all these ideas that are just sort of assumed in the tradition, assumptions. And then certain texts that kind of everybody needs to be conversant in to catch all of the ideas and all of the images and share them, works of art, maxims, and stories. I think that's really the core of a classical school.
I really like your assumptions as part of the anchor for permanent things. I like that a lot. So in the assumptions, I'd love to expand a little more on that because I think that's where we get the telos of education.
Mhm.
That's where we get the nature of a child and how they learn. And those assumptions need to be rooted in the true nature of what it
Mhm.
means to be a human being.
Yeah.
What texts would you recommend to our listeners that would guide them on the path towards the assumptions?
Um, One text that I think is a real good entry point for people, and it's been viewed this way for centuries, is Boethius's little book, The Consolation of Philosophy.
Oh, my heart is just melting right now.
And
Uh,
it's just It's a wonderful little book. And there's a story beneath it of the adversity that Boethius is undergoing unjustly, but then his false reliance on the lugubrious music of the muses and the correction that's brought to him by Lady Philosophy. But several important assumptions are presented in the course of their conversation. So you also see in a way the Socratic. You see Lady Philosophy modeling this sort of Socratic practice. She's making
Yes.
him think
Yes.
through things on his own and pulling it out of him. Um, Also, but many of the ideas are there. For instance, the goodness of being
Mhm.
is one of the things, uh, and the hierarchy of goods. Those ideas are in that little book, and in a simple way. So this is why it was used for years as a kind of primer on the tradition. So
Oh,
that's a book. You know.
interesting. I didn't realize it was used as a primer on the so honestly, every teacher, I love that you're bringing up that book because I I'll just tell you my story a tiny bit about it because this book has a real special place in my heart. I started reading it. I don't remember. It was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little longer. It was the first time I had ever read it. I had never read it, and I'm about to cry again just thinking about it. I was in book 1 and I just dropped the book and started crying. And I said, I was weeping for children today. I'm like, this book needs to be in every high school. Like I literally started weeping and crying because I was sad that I had never read it. That I had never been given this book and I was reading it going, I could have read this when I was in high school. I could have totally read this somewhere between the age of 16 and 18.
Yeah.
And it would have probably changed my life significantly.
Yeah.
Although Jane Eyre did a good job of that for me. Oh, I thank God my teacher had me read Jane Eyre, and that changed my life. But I was just crying, and I was praying for like all the teachers and children in the world. I mean, the book brought me to weeping in prayer. Like that's how powerful this book is, and I just felt so, I don't know, like a righteous anger inside that I had been robbed of this book, that I was never given it in high school. I was never given it in college. And in college, I was majoring in education. I like, why wasn't I given this book? Anyhow, so I I finished the book. Book 4 is, I think, the hardest. I had to just kind of go through it. But I've gone back and back and back to book 4. There's a poem about the Stoics on the painted porch. And I have gone back to that poem over and over and over and over. And there is so much in that one poem in book 4 that teaches us the philosophy of how a person learns. And I've actually done a whole session, a 1-hour session, one of my best sessions I ever did for school. It was actually St. Patrick's in Virginia, Western Rite Orthodox school, and Father Patrick there. And I taught this, and a few of his board members were there, and it was the first time I had ever taught. It's scary thing to teach a
Yeah.
poem from Boethius. I'm like, that was like a
Right.
big giant leap into the abyss for me, like scary. But I knew that it had truths in it, and I knew that I wasn't seeing them all. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to present this, and then we're going to see what the teachers think from it, because it kind of like is presenting it in the way that I want to model what I want them doing in the
Yeah.
classroom. So then I just told them I wanted them to draw with a partner what they saw, like what was coming out of this, um, the picture of what they were seeing of how learning happens. They came up with the most beautiful drawings, and this one person drew like a ring that was like with different layers of threads weaving, and they put all the words with it. It was beautiful. And when I was all done, one of their board members goes, "That was amazing! Like this was so good. I'm so glad we're opening a classical school." And it was just, it's that powerful. And that was just one little poem. So I'm really happy that you brought that book up. I've never talked about it on my podcast with anybody. I want it to be like a whole podcast episode
Yeah.
with an expert, because I'm not an expert in it, but I felt the power of what you're saying. So I'm really happy Like, I want all of our listeners to go buy this now and read this with
I
their
think
staff.
I always try to promote consolation of philosophy when I get a chance, and a lot of schools just don't have it in their curriculum. In fact, years ago, Dr. Louise Cowan said to me and to Catherine that you should consider having some book that students read several years in a row,
Yeah.
so that they gain the kind of insight that you gain as you mature, and they learn that lesson of going over the same thing and seeing more. And I've that's the book I would use in that way,
Yeah.
because younger kids can get the story of Boethius and his basic conversation. But
Have you had the opportunity to recommend this to schools? Like, how would you, is there a
yeah,
cycle
I
of,
often
how do
do.
you recommend this? Like, I want to at least find our listeners, our headmasters to hear what's the recommended way of implementing this?
Well, I've tried to get it into humane letters classes. There are people who use it, but um, often it's looked at as a kind of second rate thing. Which in his book, uh, The Discarded Image,
Mm-hmm.
C.S. Lewis's
Mm-hmm.
book, he has a chapter on the
Mm-hmm.
consolation of philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
and he says the beginning of it. He says there was a time, and not too long ago, maybe about a century ago, and prior to that time, it was true that almost any educated person knew this book well.
See, I've read that book, but I didn't. I need to go find that in my discarded image.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
It's also got a very. I have used this in uh, workshops with teachers, where let's read through it and only look at philosophy and the lady
Mm-hmm.
philosophy and how she is dealing with Boethius, and think of her as a teacher.
Mm.
Because she introduces something and then just lets him rant. And she doesn't say, "We're not going to talk about that right now. We got a lesson to get on to."
Right.
She actually lets him rant. She lets him say a bunch of things that are false, which she will deal with later. But the way she deals with them, and first in very tender ways and with ideas that don't completely cut him to the quick, but she shows him some of the problems in his own thought. And at one point she says, "I think you're getting stronger now, and I'm going to give you some stronger medicine." Yeah. So I think there's really good, some good lessons to be learned by the teacher on teaching from looking at the example of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
There are just so many things in that wonderful little book. So that's why I would recommend it. In fact, well, yeah, I would recommend that to someone wanting to get an idea, not of what is somebody today, someone's definition of a classical school or the classical tradition, but an entry point into the classical tradition, I think, is
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Boethius is a good
Right,
one.
because the like you said, the assumptions from that book show us that human nature hasn't changed. Like, it's relevant, it's as relevant today as it was when it was written and
Yeah.
before it was written. It's how we are. The assumption of our human nature is right there. I love that. Now, so, like, do you have students reading some of it in ninth grade, then 10th and 11th and 12th, like all through? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think that would be a good thing to do if a school has something like a humane letters class, or if they have they have well, it's interesting. Where do you put that book? Because it's got poetry,
Sure.
it's got dialogue. He meant it to not really fit into a genre, but so
So, yeah, so if you're opening a new classical school, you've got to rethink what does high school
yeah,
look like so that this can work. So you're
yeah,
right, humane letters
yeah,
is the right place to put it, but the
yeah.
problem is we continue to open classical schools a- assuming the same model that we have, that, like, why are we using the same model that, well, because it's what we're
Uh,
familiar with and it's what we think we have to have for
it's always,
transcripts.
and again, we're working within a tradition, and um, And in a tradition, we're always borrowing on something prior,
Hmm. Right.
borrowing. But
I
but
guess I'm saying though, like that so many schools are basing their model off of the progressive model.
oh yeah, yeah,
Like that we have to have these subjects, things are not integrated. And if
right,
you're going to open a classical school, you need to kind of back away from this Prussian progressive model and
yeah,
rethink what your classrooms actually need to look like.
right. And Dr. Christopher Perrin with
Hmm.
Classical Academic Press has lately been talking a lot about this how we divide the disciplines just according to the modern um, Prussian model, as you said, and also this further division of them into humanities and sciences, which is an arbitrary division. Something we should really work at reuniting in classical schools.
Talk about. This is kind of off topic from our agenda and our script here of what we're going to talk about. But I have this essay you've written that I have not read yet. Unfortunately, it's been on my desk for a year. I have it right in front of me. Schooling in Byzantium.
Yeah,
So obviously, I'm assuming that this is going to talk about what school was like for early Christians, because that's what I'm inferring from the title. So would you like to talk a little bit about that? The early Christian
sure.
model of schools, of
And
education?
it actually, um, it's really, I wouldn't say the early Christian. I would say the way schools developed over the Christian centuries. And from the title, you can tell this is primarily in the Eastern Christian world.
Mhm.
Um, and what, so I guess to try to reduce it here, the because the Christians believed in permanent things, because they believed that uh, that there was a divine logos that tries to work with the hearts of all humans and does to varying degrees. Um, that, as Saint Justin Martyr said, that any that all truth belongs to Christians, and any anyone who speaks the truth is someone we should listen to. And so they didn't just dismiss everything from prior to Christ, as Saint Paul speaking on the Areopagus quotes a, an old Greek poet to the people. So all of that is to say that clearly the Christians had some revolutionary ideas, and they were um, the one God in three persons and the incarnation of the second person uh, to restore the divine life to all humans. Um, but they looked back and found certain practices that were taught and certain works that were taught that were worth using and worth learning. And so, over the course of the first 3 centuries, I would say, of Christianity, there was a new form of education that was cultivated primarily in, it seems to me, in the community of the Cappadocians in Asia Minor,
Mhm.
but also in around Alexandria. And
Mhm.
this became what we call a liberal arts education.
Yeah.
you know, this,
Well, my patron
this
saint is
was,
Saint Catherine of Alexandria, so I'm pretty sure she had a
yeah,
classical education
okay.
because she was a master in rhetoric.
And
Yeah.
that's my wife's patron saint as well. So, but they saw clearly that grammar was very important. And well, I was once talking to Metropolitan Jonah, and he just sort of threw off this little statement. He said, St. Basil wrote a whole book on prepositions. I said, what?
I
And,
never knew that.
well, he was overstating it, but it's true. You get that SBS Press, in its little patristic series, has that book, It's Only Human Person by St. Basil. And he goes into these great
Oh,
distinctions about the use of prepositions. And then he sort of justifies that by talking about the importance of words and of grammar to our thought and to our beliefs.
oh, I
So
love that. I'm getting
it's
that book today.
yeah, it's a wonderful. But all of that is to say that there was clearly, they agreed with the ancients in the importance of language in
Right.
of forming our thought, but also uh, clearly sharing our thoughts with others. Because the idea, the Christian idea of the human as a person, is that we are meant to be in communion with others. And one of the primary tools of that communion is language.
Hmm.
So our use of language is very important, and that kind of being the first as one of the first tools that you're learning in an education. But beyond that, there were images you're learning. There's poetry that you're learning. The two main things that were taught in the schools to the young children, the two works they memorized a lot. And by the time a student was out of the I don't know, I guess what we would call elementary school.
Hmm.
By the time they had finished that course, they would have memorized the entire Iliad and they would have memorized the entire Psalter. They were memorizing from
Hmm.
the Septuagint in Greek. And you're getting the pre-Christian view of what is the great and heroic man, and you're getting the Christian uh, view of the man. In fact, the first psalm begins, "Blessed is the man."
Right. Right.
So, it, and so the education went on with other great works of literature. In fact, they collected a few very select um, uh, works of the tragedians. They
Hmm.
filtered these and brought them in. Antigone was one that was always taught in the Christian schools and was
Hmm.
empty because of the theme of the conflict between religious duty and civil duty,
Hmm. Hmm.
which was very important to Christians. So,
I've been listening to the audio Bible. I've been listening to First and Second Samuel. I'm almost done with Second Samuel, and it's been a long time since I've read it, and listening to it told as a story is just really a beautiful experience. But one of the things that's been striking me through listening to these battles between Saul and David, which are
mm,
just like gut wrenching, I've been like, wow, this is so much like Homer. Like
mhm,
students should be reading
yeah,
First and Second Samuel while they're reading Homer because they're very like in my opinion, like the heroic ideas and the battle. It's all very much the same.
right, yeah,
And going back to our assumptions of human nature, both are reflecting that.
right,
That
right,
same
yeah,
idea. Well, I know we have still more things that we want to talk about. Like one of the ideas that I want to hear more from you, and we touched on a little bit about it when we talked about Boethius, is like the right books. What are the right books? I know that you have some thoughts and you have a lot of wisdom with your many, many years,
well,
decades in education on perhaps some ideas that people who are creating their book lists for their schools and their uh, typical, these are the books we have to read because we're a classical school. And I know you have some thoughts on that. So I'd like you to share what those thoughts are.
yeah. One of my first thoughts about reading lists in classical schools is, from what I've seen, often we just read too many books.
Mhm.
And one reason is because there's so much good out there. Uh, the tradition itself has so much in it that we can't do all of it. And you get a bunch of teachers together, and you're always going to get people saying they've got to do these 5 things. They have to, and suddenly your reading list will grow and grow and grow. and you're not spending quality time on any of it. So here's what I think we should remember, and that is the classical tradition is too vast for any of us to implement it fully.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tradition. It's not a curriculum.
Hmm.
So first of all, just be at peace with that and realize that your job is not to run them through the entire tradition. You can't do that. Um, the people we look back at and admire in the, as liberal arts teachers in previous times didn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time when no one in the West read Homer or Plato. There was a time when no one in the East read the Aeneid. There was a time when they were all reading, when the two halves of the Christian world were reading, one in Greek and one in Latin, and in those linguistic traditions. Well, so again, I'm just saying there's too much. So what do we do? Really just, I'd say we need to do two things. One is really limit our reading list to the best of the best, some real um, undisputed classic works. And then, because this is a tradition, which means it continues, find some works that are consistent with the tradition, but more contemporary that you can include. But I wouldn't go too heavy on that. But there are a lot of good things like that for younger students.
Oh yeah, like C.S. Lewis's the Lion, the Witch, and the Ward, the Narnia series.
Right, but I would also say Frog and Toad.
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely, Frog and Toad. You can't ever forget Frog and
There's,
Toad.
one of that in fact, the cave allegory is such a wonderful, wonderful story from Plato's Republic, and I think it's something I wish I had read and had known much younger in life, just because it's so uh,
Oh,
full of.
you're already answering my closing question. What do you
Oh,
think you
sorry,
should have read?
sorry,
No, it's okay.
but I would say this: the same image and is given in one of the Frog and Toad stories.
Of
I
the
think,
allegory of the cave?
yeah, I, yes, I will make
Oh
the allegory of the cave comes up everywhere. It's
yeah,
in, but I love in Frog. I think it's Frog and Toad all year, and the story is, I think it's the story of springtime, and Frog comes to Toad's door and knocks on the door. Toad is inside. He's got the windows shuttered, and Frog is saying, come out into the sunshine. And Toad says, go away, go away. He doesn't want to be disturbed. And the only way Toad can compel him to come out is to trick him with the calendar on the wall, which is like the images,
yeah.
he manipulates the image. He tears off several of the pages and says, look, it's me. And it's not. But anyway, some of the really important images show up all over the place,
You're right.
and I don't know what got us there in the conversation,
Oh, just what
but
books
yeah,
should be in curriculum?
what
Yeah,
to do with the reading list. Yeah, I would really, I would reduce them and let the students take time on. I think one of the reasons that we read so many things is because we don't necessarily know what to do with what we read.
mm.
Uh, Again, if you look at the practice, say in the medieval schools, they read very few books, but they read them well. In fact, they read in an opposite way than we seem to do. We tend to read the thing over at the surface, then start taking it apart a little bit, going down into the meaning, and then we stop and get back up on the surface and go forward. The way they read in the Middle Ages was this: they would parse out the sentences. Remember that people might be speaking a medieval vernacular of Italian or something, but reading in Latin. or they spoke a medieval vernacular of Greek, but they also were reading Homer and the Bible, and they would parse out the things and make sure that they got what was actually said correct before they did any interpretation. So they would pay, and you see, these are older students, and they're still doing grammar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're parsing out what is said. Then they're taking out any words they don't know and defining them. Then, if the author uses an allusion or a reference, they make sure they get the allusion and what is the reference. Then they're ready to say, okay, what does this mean? We go completely backwards. We start with meaning and interpretation, and we never get down to the levels of clarity with language that they tended to begin with. So I'm not recommending, I don't know if even modern classical educators could stomach that method, but I think we need to read fewer books and read them uh, more carefully. And I'm sorry, one more
No,
point on this,
I'm listening.
and
Keep
that
going.
is that in um, years ago, I was teaching literature. Uh, I was a headmaster of a school, but I taught a literature class. And if I remember correctly, I think we read 4 books that year. We read the Odyssey. Yeah, this is well. Let's see. What did we read? We read the Odyssey. We read the we read Paradise Lost, which is beautiful, beautiful English prose.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I think we read one other that I'm not remembering now. But then we spent the majority of the last semester on the Brothers Karamazov,
Mm.
which I think of as a work in the epic tradition. You know, it's a novel, but it's a it's epic in many ways. Um, but that's just an example. And of course, I had to give the students a way of collecting a lot of different information. When we did Paradise Lost, we actually studied the speeches of the demons
Mm-hmm.
as rhetorical pieces.
Got it. Yep, that's perfect. I love that.
And I had them, they kept notebooks over time on these works that we read. When we got to Brothers Karamazov, which is sort of a cosmos of its own, they had notebooks that divided things into taking notes on Alyosha and on Ivan and all these different characters, so that they would over time collect a lot of distinct information in different places. Um, but helping them to really go down and requiring them to memorize passages. And so instead of just reading a passage and having a seminar where you're sort of surface level, um, really finding ways to dig down into the work, because sometimes great insights and epiphanies come from one small grammatical point,
Mm-hmm.
rather than from big ideas at the surface level.
Hmm. What grade were you doing this in?
That was with the juniors. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. So yeah, that's the year that I wish I would have read Boethius. My junior year. That's probably would have been the perfect year for me.
uh,
Even if they would have just given me book one, I felt like it would have given me an appetite to finish the book on my own, you know,
yeah.
to tackle it. That's another thing that I think is worthwhile is tackling something like that. And it does allow the students to get the appetite to finish it on their own. I really appreciate that you're talking about reading more carefully, slowly, going deeper, um,
Yeah.
not devouring books. It's like it's like we're gluttons with books. Almost.
Yeah.
We're stuffing ourselves so full, and then the danger I think for children in this is that it's puffing them up
Right.
and causing, the opposite of what we want. We're developing prideful, puffed up heads.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, and I think another thing we should remember in our reading is this, that clearly we want to have students dig down into some of these things. And you want a student, when they're reading poetry, to see the form that the poet is using in his craft. Uh, but we also want to make sure we always let them enjoy the work.
mhm.
What I'm saying, I would say applies to both, let's say, Latin instruction and literature or poetry instruction. And that is this: often we're always plowing new ground with the students, always, 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 which can be tedious. And I once heard a Latin teacher, and it was Dr. Grace West from the University of Dallas, who was later at Hillsdale. But she said, every now and then we need to back up a couple of chapters where we're teaching students Latin. We need to back up a couple of chapters and just let them read and enjoy what they've learned.
Mhm.
Enjoy reading in Latin and enjoy the story. Back up a couple of chapters. And I have thought of the application of that in so many ways. If you're dragging students through Paradise Lost, every now and then back up, and some passages that are just beautiful to read, just read them and let the students enjoy the images. In literature, we need to make sure that they don't think the only thing we are to do with these works is to dissect them and analyze them.
Right,
Not to
exactly.
just read them and enjoy them. So, maybe one day a week or one day every other week, just back off and read some of what you've already gone through and enjoy.
Mhm. Do you have any thoughts on psychoanalyzing books and reading books from a narcissist like point of view?
Yeah, don't.
So maybe explain to our listeners
Oh, yeah.
what I mean by this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, right?
When you say, um, yeah, using different critical theories
Yeah.
on books, or yeah, I think um, you know there was a Russian author, Mikhail Bakhtin, who once said, anything that is rooted in the present will die with the present, and that there is this longer view that we want to find in all the things that we're contemplating and studying. And uh, I think sometimes if we if we will, works can get psychologized or historicized, or in all kinds of deformative ways. And one thing we might consider, let's just say with literature, is that how important uh, how important is it that Milton is writing at the time of the English Civil War, or how important is it that he chooses to write in the epic form that Aeneid and Homer use?
Mhm.
What's the more important thing? And in Bakhtin's idea, what's more important is that he rises up out of his time and joins Homer and Virgil in the epic tradition. And that if we read these things in their traditions, rather than trying to uh, discern a historical or a political or a psychological, something that's idiosyncratic to the author that happened in this author's life. We all are embedded in the particular. We all are embedded in the flaws of our own flaws, our family's flaws, our nation's flaws. We all are embedded in those things, but that's what this kind of education is about. It's about rising up out of those things. This is the cave allegory. We are all in our own caves looking at false images, and the education is turning from those, getting up into the real light and seeing things as they are. So all of the theories that want to just say, whether this man writes from this certain bias of his, or that he writes from this certain psychological trauma of his, or uh, let's find out what the greater insights are, what show us what is universally human and what's possible for humans of all ages, of all nations, of all temperaments.
Hmm. It's a really hard thing, I think, for a lot of teachers to break out of because so many teachers have a degree in teaching.
Right.
And they're taught that they're supposed to follow these, state standards and they have to analyze
Yeah,
everything. And I've noticed that with teachers, literature teachers, it's a real struggle for them to not pull the children into this whole analysis rather
mhm.
than just enjoying the books. And I think when you going back to you talking about classical education as an ethos, thinking about what's that ethos. Well, I think we need to be really careful not to analyze so much that students walk away and they never want to read it again.
Right. Yeah.
Like what we really want is for them to enjoy it so much that they want to read it again when they're 30, when they're 25, or read it to their children. And I think that keeping that in mind ought to have a pretty strong, um, what am I thinking? Like a strong influence on how we approach a book in a
Yeah,
classroom.
the action of the story is the thing, not
Hmm.
some other filter that you can run it through. And as you're saying, you want them to read them in a way so that they can come to love certain characters, come to despise certain other
Hmm.
characters, or rather actions of characters.
Hmm.
Um, and that's part of what Aristotle called teaching children to love and hate properly. You want them to love what's good, and you want them to hate what's
Well, and
unjust. And
yeah, and I think that believing in the child and in the student that they are as fully human as you are and very, very capable of thinking,
yeah, oh yeah,
that the teacher really doesn't always need to do much. The teacher just needs to step back and let the book do what it's doing and allow the Holy Spirit to work through the story because stories are powerful
hmm,
and they can really speak to a child,
yeah,
and in probably a lot more profound way than any lecture from a teacher.
yeah, yeah.
So the art of sort of stepping back, and this is why I love narration so much because when the students read and they narrate, they're making it their own. When they narrate, they're actually that's part of the digestive process. And they're pulling what they're narrating the things they remember because that's probably what stood out to them, and it's going to help them uh, digest it better. And I love narration in a classroom because all the kids are hearing the different things that other kids heard. And then what I've heard from children is they say, "Oh, we like narration because it's like getting to read it for a second time, and we're remembering that something we missed, or somebody else heard something that I didn't hear."
Yeah, it's really good for several reasons. One is it's an exercise in recall, but it also shows the children that a lot of our knowledge is communal knowledge.
Yes,
A lot of the knowledge we have is knowledge that we have put together with others,
I love that.
and that's very much Christos Giannaris, a contemporary Greek philosopher, made this point that um, that the knowledge we have from science is not really empirical, because the knowledge we hold from science is communal knowledge. It's many things that we've brought from the past, we've added to or we've corrected, but it's knowledge we hold as a community, not individually. In fact, he makes the point: most things we say we know, we don't know individually. We know as part of a community, which means it's really faith. It's faith in the accounts of a trusted community.
Well, and Facebook is a great way of proving how communal we are. Like we want community so much that we join social media because we want to connect with people. We want to have conversations. We want to be interacting with people,
Mm-hmm.
especially with whom we agree. Or if we want to argue and be right all the time, then we're going to join social media clubs that we don't agree with so that we can argue. But yeah, I mean, to your point, yes. I mean, we are very, very communal, and just the explosion of Facebook shows that how much we need community.
Right. Right.
And for some, that may be the only community they have, sadly. But
Yeah.
we were created for community.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
Individuality is one of the myths of our time.
very much so.
Yep.
Yes, very much so. Well, this has been a really beautiful conversation. I've actually learned quite a bit today. And I would like to close our conversation asking you what I ask all my guests to either tell of a book you wish you had read sooner in your life, or a quote from a book that has had a strong impact on your life. Or you can tell both.
Yeah. No, I have I try. I'm going to do a thing that I try not to do because there's a quote that I read many years ago and it just meant a lot to me and it continues to. And it's from C.S. Lewis. And I try not to participate in the obligatory quotes from C.S. Lewis, which seem to be everywhere. But I read this again. It was from that Saint Vladimir's press series of patristics, Athanasius on the Incarnation. It's the introduction
Oh,
to that
yes.
translation by C.S. Lewis,
Yes.
and in it he's making an argument for the reading of old
Yeah.
books, and he says this: every age has its own outlook. It's especially good at seeing certain truths and especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books.
Yeah. I love that so much.
But the
I
importance is that they're not that they're old, but that they're pulling us out of our
yes.
parochialism in time.
So good, so good. It's funny, I came across that particular essay that he wrote a long time ago and read it. And then a few years ago, I picked up on the Incarnation and read it for the first time. Shamefully, that I had not, again, another book I had not read till I was almost 50. And I was like, oh, this is the source of that
Yeah.
wonderful essay by C.S. Lewis. It's on the Incarnation by Saint Athanasius. I had no idea, and I
Yeah.
learned from reading that Saint Athanasius lived around the same time as Saint Catherine of Alexandria, both in Alexandria, so they probably knew each other. He probably knew of her. Yeah, I don't remember who lived sooner. They were really close, overlapping, and
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of excited. I was like, yeah, so great things have come out of Alexandria from that
Yes.
sense. Yeah,
Yes.
that time period. Great people. I should read more of the people from that era because On the Incarnation is absolute most beautiful, like right up there with Boethius, right? That's
It's
another
a
one they should be reading.
wonderful little book. Yes.
Yeah, it's a profound book, one that is worth reading every year
Mm-hmm.
for sure. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brian. This was just a real treat to have you on today.
Well, thank you so much. It was great to reconnect, and been too long since we've spoken, and so look forward to talking again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."